I'm going to call to order this Lacey City Council meeting on May 14th, 2020. And next we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. For the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag,
United States of
America,
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. In tonight's meeting, we're doing it completely remotely because of the Governor's Inslee's Proclamation 2028. We do have a agenda that's and a consent agenda that's been published. Can I get a motion to approve?
Move to approve the agenda and consent agenda.
Second.
Been moved and second to approve today's agenda and consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries, and we have an agenda. And we did not receive any public comments that would be submitted to public comment at ci.wa.us. That closed today at 12 o'clock. And as far as I know, we did not receive any public comments for today's agenda. So next up on our agenda is under resolution, the investment policy amendments. We're going to Troy Wu, who's our finance director. Hopefully. There he is.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone well. This afternoon for your consideration, as the mayor said, is a resolution. This resolution will amend the city's investment policy, which was previously established in early 2018. And really what this amendment does is brings our policy more concurrent with the Washington State Investment Board's policy. So in a sense, this is a housekeeping change. There are specific changes to the section related to corporate notes and commercial paper. Really what these changes do is add more details and more guidance as to the policy that relates to those types of investments. The policy also updates the table in which really outlines the minimum rating requirements for each investment, as well as the maximum amount per type of investment. I do want to spend a little time on the prohibited investment section. I've already received a couple comments from both city manager and council. What this does is it removes the negative credit watch, which on the face of it looks like it's weakening the policy, but I want to assure the council that it does not do this. Really what this section previously was in the policy for was the US government was actually on a negative watch at that time that we developed this policy. That since has been lifted. And the reason we had that in place is because US treasuries and agency securities don't have ratings or minimum rating requirements, which generally govern the other investment vehicles that we use. So we want to make sure that we had that in the policy to make sure that we were watchful for that negative watch, but really that is no longer the case currently. So again, it's not weakening the policy at all. We are still governed by ratings, and we watch those ratings very carefully in terms of our investment. So again, these constitute mainly housekeeping changes. So the recommendation for you this afternoon is to adopt the resolution, which will amend our investment policy. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
I'd make a motion to approve or and adopt the proposed resolution 1089, amending the January 2018 investment policy.
I second it.
It's been moved in second. Discussion. it's not really necessarily pertaining to this policy, but obviously, Troy, a lot has changed with COVID-19 and the massive drop in our in interest rates. I know we have a whole policy that is dealing with our investments. Can you maybe tell us quickly what the biggest change is, and is the city doing anything dramatic in response to the interest rates dropping so low?
No, actually, we're quite the opposite. We're holding steady to the city's strategy. And mainly when we look at times like this, we're looking at duration. So we're still staying with our target duration of 1.4 years. It's a kind of a neutral stance, but we are looking at different types of investments to help diversify. As an example, an area that we've been able to pick up some gain in yield is the municipal bond or the bond market. Right now, I mean, if you think about where rates are, I think that school districts and local governments may try to take advantage of the lower rates and continue to keep their economies going by continuing with their capital projects. So we're seeing some yield gain in that area, but overall, we're really not changing a lot. It is important that we keep with our strategy, just because we're looking at kind of weighted averages as well within our portfolio, but really no change at all.
Thank you for that. Is there any other questions? Seeing none, it's been moved and seconded to adopt this proposed resolution amending the January 2018 investment policy. All in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Next up, under ordinances, the 2020.
Mayor, please.
Yes, Councilman.
Yeah, so my daughter has a Zoom meeting herself with the dance class. So if you hear any kind of like weird banging noises, probably tap or ballet or something. I just wanted to bring it to council.
Okay. Just try to keep your self on mute as much as you possibly can. Appreciate the heads up. So next up is welcome to our new normal here. Next up under ordinances, our 2020 budget amendment for COVID-19. Back to you, Troy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to share my screen here so you have a PowerPoint before you. So up for consideration is another out-of-cycle budget amendment related directly to the COVID impact it's had to revenues. And you saw or heard a preview from the city manager at your last meeting in terms of the city action, in terms of dealing with some of the shortfalls that we're expecting. So this is the outline I'd like to cover. We want to talk about some of the assumptions in terms of the 2020 budget and the impacts of COVID-19. We'll talk directly about the revenue reductions that we expect, as well as the recommendations for reducing the budget. And as you know from the last discussion, it was a little bit up in the air in terms of the RAC and lodging tax. So we do have recommendations for you tonight for those. And then we'd like to talk a little bit about economic development and social service budgets. I believe the council's probably heard from some of these organizations and the need for help. And then we'll just wrap things up with some summary comments. So in looking at the economic assumptions, obviously with the stay-at-home orders, we're seeing some pretty dramatic changes out there in the economy. And we think that the proposal before you is really assuming a severe 3-month impact. And as you heard from the city manager, we're really looking at a March to June timeframe in terms of businesses being closed and the ramping back up into the new norm. Of course, we're under the governor's stay home, stay healthy order, which is at this point been extended through May 31st. The governor has started to release more details on the Safe Start order, which is a phased approach to reopening the state's economy. And of course, this is going to be based on data and metrics that help support the safe opening. This is being closed and then
Oops. Are you,
well, am I back? Okay.
yep, you're back. You got muted there for a second.
Yep, sorry about that. And then, of course, we're seeing, on the actual data in terms of the economy is really kind of guessing at this point, but we know that we're facing record unemployment. In fact, unemployment numbers that we've never seen in the history of the United States. I believe we're up to 36 million unemployment claims for the nation through today. I believe we're in a presumed recessions position. Of course, the Federal Reserve has already acted in March. They took rates down to 0 in 2 emergency actions. We know that retail sales are being severely impacted. At the national level for March, retail sales dropped almost 9%, which is a record. And that was really just the tail end of March. So we think April is actually going to be worse than that. And then we're seeing the inflation number for April is actually a negative. Normally, you would think that would be good news for lower prices, but unfortunately, lower prices are because things aren't being purchased at the same level. So prices have to come down. But of course, that has negative impacts in terms of jobs and manufacturing. So certainly a lot of information that's out there, just really nothing in detail. So in terms of our revenue assumptions, they are at this point best guesses just because we don't have that specific data behind it. But I do want to share, what our assumptions are. So we're assuming a 30% reduction in sales tax. If you really kind of think about that, that's 3 months of no sales tax essentially. So a pretty severe impact, and that's almost $3.8 million reduction. We have the same assumption for B&O tax. Of course, the basis for that tax is roughly the same as sales tax. So again, a 30% reduction, that's about $785,000. Other taxes, which in this case are admission and gambling tax. Admissions tax is basically movie theaters, and of course they're impacted by the business closures. We have a 50% reduction within these two tax areas, coming at about $283,000. And then state shared revenues is about a 20% reduction, and this is basically all within the fuel tax area for the street maintenance division. With stay-at-home orders, most of us are working from home, which means we're not getting in our cars and traveling to work. So we're expecting a decline in consumption of fuel. Looking at parks and recreation fees, we've built in a 50% reduction. This is basically the loss of all summer, or late spring and summer programs. And what you did not hear 2 weeks ago from the city manager was the impact of the regional athletic complex. And we do have estimates for that, and that's about $330,000 in lost revenue. So think about league fees and field rentals in terms of events and that sort of thing. So again, a pretty severe impact for parks.
Troy,
Yes.
question on that last one. Is that 50? So Parks and Rec, is it 878 and an additional 330, or does it 878 include the 330 from the rec?
No, it's combined, so it's over 1.1 million.
Thank you.
Those are two separate.
And then interest earnings, as the mayor alluded to during the last topic, we are expecting a pretty big drop off in our interest earnings. For the general fund, we're projecting about a $455,000 reduction. And to give you the idea of how quickly rates dropped, at the end of the year, we were earning about 2%, and essentially overnight rates was 2%. And as I stated, the Federal Reserve and 2 emergency moves in early March dropped that basically to 0 being the lower threshold. And what we saw the last time when the Federal Reserve rate was 0 to 0.25%, we were earning about 0.1% on our overnight investment. So that's a very, very big difference. The overall projected revenue decrease is almost $6.7 million. You might remember the city manager presented to you about a $6.3 million reduction, but the addition is the rack, that $330,000. So what's before you tonight is almost $6.7 million in revenue reductions. So looking at the expenditure side and how we're going to deal with this $6.7 million deficit, some of these you heard again last week or 2 weeks ago from the city manager. Really have three different areas in which we're recommending the reductions be addressed with. The first is about $1.9 million in operations and maintenance reductions. These are the reductions that came from department recommendations in terms of their review of their budgets. I certainly want to acknowledge my colleagues, the other directors, as well as their staff and their efforts in looking at reductions that were possible that had the most minimal impact on our services and what our citizens have come to expect. The next area is more one-time projects and capital equipment purchases. We found about $1.2 million in savings within this category. And then the remainder is coming from using 1/2 of the 2-month operating reserve that's been established by city policy. So about $3.6 million coming from this source. So I do want to share some of the details of each of these three areas. So in terms of operation and maintenance, about $748,000 is coming from salaries and benefits. And I do want to emphasize that this does not include layoffs, does not include furloughs, except for part-time staff in terms of furloughs. The majority of the savings are coming from delays of filling vacant positions. So very similar to the approach that we used when we were addressing the Great Recession without having to lay off positions at this point. The neighborhood grant program was identified, so $60,000 coming from this program. We found about $402,000 in savings from contract services. This didn't require any changes to contracts, but really looking at what we think the actual usage of these contracts are going to be. So as an example, jail services, we have very few people actually in jail at this point just because of what's happening in the court system. So we're seeing our bed nights within a jail dropping. So it's really just a volume issue, as well as looking at kind of some historic usage of the jail. Joint Animal Services, we actually adopted the budget at a higher number than what actually was adopted by the board in terms of our annual assessment. So we took the number that, the highest number that could have occurred, and then the board came in and adopted assessments that were lower than that number. So we had some savings there. And then for custodial and copier services, this is really looking at historic usage numbers. We were able to find some areas in the budget that we could cut without having to reduce service. Continuing with operation and maintenance reductions, social services, we found about $80,000 in reductions here. Part of that comes from the Thurston County line item that we have in the budget. This is really a carryover from previous budgets. So we were over budgeted in this area. Really what that line item represents is the substance abuse payment that we are required to make towards programs that comes from our liquor excise tax and distributions from the state. The mitigation site, you might remember we had $200,000 in the budget for the mitigation site project, which at the time we didn't think was going to happen in 2020, but I understand that we may start having those conversations with our neighboring cities. So we'll come back to that topic here a little bit later on in the presentation, but about $50,000 is taken from that line item. Street electricity, this is a trend analysis and actual usage. So we believe we had $200,000 of capacity within this line item. And really we need to look at the LED replacement program as the reason for this. So it's probably 5, maybe 6 years ago, we began replacing our street lights with LED lighting, which results in a reduction in electricity usage. So certainly want to commend our Public Works Department as well as the council to have that foresight and to start that program. And also PSC in terms of the grant funding that has been made available for that. So again, we think we're seeing those savings because of that program. And then the remainder, I just threw everything into one number, 182,000. This is basically everything else. So a lot smaller reductions in terms of travel budgets, supplies, and professional services. And then there's $250,000 that was identified specifically within the RAC's budget. A lot of this is related to the fact the RAC's not even open. So we're not having to keep the lights on at the field during the night. And we don't have seasonal staffing maintaining the park as much as we normally would if it were in full operation. So these are basically operation and maintenance reductions because of the fact it's closed down. In terms of capital and one-time projects, I'll just run through these really quickly. The Bush Park playground equipment replacement is being deferred, as well as the city facilities condition assessment. You might remember from the budget adoption, we want to look at all of our buildings in terms of the condition that they're in terms of planning for potential upgrades or replacements, as well as just the overall use and looking at the efficiency of the use of space. So we're going to defer that. The Northeast Lacey Market Study is being deferred. The Midtown amenities, of course, this comes from the Woodland District recommendations, that is being deferred as well. The Port of Olympia memorandum of understanding for improvements to the building that's in Northeast Lacey is being deferred. Replacement reserves, you might remember this from our discussions with the 6-year strategic financial plan. So we have 2 different line items in the budget, one for facilities replacement and as well as equipment replacement. This was really in the budget to help us address emergency replacements, as well as a way to fund replacements in future budgets. So we are recommending that that be eliminated from the budget as well. The Wonderwood Trail improvements is being deferred as well. That's almost 68,000. Then again, I have kind of a catch-all line item here of miscellaneous, about 91,000. These are the smaller equipment replacements and purchases within Parks and Streets Department. And then, as I said, the remainder of the recommendations in terms of dealing with replacements is to use one half of your 2-month operating reserve, again, $3.6 million. And just a reminder to the council and as well as the public listening, this 2-month reserve is, the purpose is for this exact thing, to deal with emergencies and any pauses to city revenues. So it's an emergency tool that we could use. It's also a cash flow tool as well in terms of some of the cyclical nature of some of our revenues, specifically looking at property tax, and only comes in 2 times a year. So I do want to spend some time talking about what the recommendation is for the RAC, the Regional Athletic Complex. So our assumption for this budget recommendation is that the RAC will start to receive some use in September, when we think we'll have small groups, 10 or less, that are able to use the park. In terms of the revenue projection, it's a pretty severe reduction. It's about almost 50%. So in terms of loss of fees and field rentals and line items like that, it's almost $400,000 in reduction. The revenue projection also assumes that the lodging tax support of $160,000 will not be coming in, and you'll see that from the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee recommendation. So in terms of how do we address that deficit, the about 250,000 or so is coming from direct line item reductions. Some of that coming from part-time labor, as well as the supplies and operational costs that aren't occurring because the park isn't opened. So again, that's about 250,000 or so. The remainder of the deficit is going to be made up in reserves. And the point I want to make here is we're not recommending that we use the 2-month operating reserve. Quite honestly, that operating reserve isn't enough to make up for this deficit. So between the line item recommendations and what we expect the revenue reductions are, we have about a $300,000 difference. The 2-month operating reserve is only about $200,000. So we're recommending that we use $300,000 from unencumbered reserves within the RAC fund to cover that deficit. Again, keeping the 2-month reserve intact. So I do want to present the Lodging Tax Advisory Committee recommendations to you. Congratulations, Councilmember Miller, for your first meeting. It certainly wasn't an easy one. Normally, this is a committee that's actually one of the more fun committees that we get to serve and support because we're talking about festivals and tourism and families, but this was a very different tone to it, having to deal with the shortcomings that we think are coming at us from this fund. So within this fund, we're projecting about a 56% reduction to hotel motel tax. We think that the loss is going to occur throughout 2020. I'm sure you're aware and have heard the impacts that are happening to tourism and hospitality across the nation. I mean, it's essentially not happening. And what we're understanding is our local hotels are only really running at 10 to 20% of capacity at this point. And again, we don't think that this is going to be a quick recovery for that industry. So again, about 56% reduction to hotel motel tax. We are recommending the use of 1/2 of the 2-month operating reserve within this fund. So the recommendation from the committee is to preserve the contracted services that we have with some of our economic development and related or tourism related services, as well as facility operations. So that would include the Lacey Chamber, the Washington Center, Experience Olympia and Beyond, and of course our own Lacey Museum. And the funding for events are limited to those costs that have already occurred. Of course, as this was happening, these events were in their planning stages in the early spring for some of these late spring and summer events. And I think we are canceled through, most of these events have been canceled through July, but we do still have some other events that haven't been canceled yet. So we do have a little bit of cushion built into the recommendation from the committee. So I have a side-by-side comparison for you. So this is in the middle column, you have the 2020 adopted budget of $596,000. The proposed budget before you is $275,000 roughly for motel hotel tax, as well as a little bit of interest earnings. The expenditure proposal before you is almost $240,000, which leaves about $35,000 in any cash or in reserve. And this is here for two purposes. One is just in case our revenue projections are too positive. In fact, the receipts we received from February were already $13,000 lower than I expected. So a little bit of cushion for that projection, as well as some budget remaining for these other festivals that may be occurring costs. So I just want to make sure that we're able to address those. So that is in your ordinance tonight. So as you do with the budget, you have to you can't adopt this without, if you have any changes, you'll have to go back to committee, but that is the recommendation at this point. I do want to point out that we did include $100,000 for each economic development and social services. I've already heard that we may have to support some of these functions in the area. So wanted to provide some funding for that. So there's $100,000 in, like I said, for each. So $100,000 for economic development. This is to assist those economic development related organizations that may be experiencing membership declines, as well as $100,000 for social services. Obviously, the need for social services and that sort of help in our community are probably greater than they've been for a number of years. So $100,000 there. And I said I'd come back to the mitigation site, the $200,000. And at the time we were putting together this recommendation for you, we took those monies because we weren't expecting to have that conversation about the mitigation site. So we took those monies and funded these programs. And I would recommend we still do that at this point, because I think the conversations that are going to happen with our neighboring local governments is going to take a little bit of while. We do have other one-time reserves that we could address those issues as the conversations occur. So this isn't to say that we don't have the funding to participate in any sort of mitigation site, but you know, the information is quickly changing, and this is certainly an illustration of that. So again, I'd recommend that we keep with this recommendation and handle any sort of other mitigation site type discussion with any other reserves that we may have. So to summarize the amendments, like I said, this is a challenging time for us. We're really making these recommendations without having solid data. I do know that we are going to see a reduction in revenues. I just can't give you precise numbers. As you know, most of our economic indicators are already backwards looking, and we know there's going to be delays to that data. It's because of the actions taken by both the city and the state in terms of helping business that may be dealing with financial challenges by providing extensions to tax due dates. So we really are not going to see any precise data until the late July, early August timeframe. So I just want to make sure that we emphasize that we are acting in a timely manner over exactness, but we do think it's important that we act now in terms of, rather than waiting. I do want to point out that there are line items in your amendment for transfers. And what happens is when we reverse or defer some of these one-time capital projects that were funded with one-time revenues or one-time out of reserves, a lot of times those are transfers between departments, and some of those we've reversed the transfers as well. So you're not going to be able to find $6.7 million as a clean number within your ordinance because of the impact that these transfers have. And I do want to point out, also related to those transfers, we have basically a net positive of $405,000 coming back to reserves. And I think it would be prudent to keep those in reserves as a cushion in terms of maybe future actions that we may have, or if the economy turns out to be even worse than we expected, this will give us a little bit of action that we could use these reserves. So again, this amendment does include an additional $405,000 of additional reserves. In terms of the future, again, I've already talked about the delayed economic data. We're not going to see sales tax information end of July. The city, of course, took action to delay the first quarter deadline to July 31st. So we're not going to see those numbers again until probably August. I do, with this proposal before you assumes a 3-month event. As I said, things are changing very quickly, and the state isn't going to be opening unless the metrics support that. So we really don't know how quickly we're going to reopen as a state. So the longer this safe start timeline goes, the more damage I think is going to occur to the economy. So in terms of the severity of the impact and the subsequent recovery length. I do want to share good news. I'm sure most of the council is aware, but the public may not be aware that the city of Lacey is in line to receive $1.5 million in CARES Act funding distribution from the state, and specifically the Department of Commerce. This is a per capita calculation. I believe it's $30 per capita, and for us that's $1.5 million. The Department of Commerce, I believe today, has released some of the details of the program. We haven't really had a chance to go through that in detail, but in general, this is going to be a reimbursement basis. So we're going to have to incur costs and then seek reimbursement from the Department of Commerce. There's some timing recommendations or requirements within the funding. It's limited to those expenditures that occurred basically in this calendar year, but these are for unbudgeted expenditures. And in terms of unbudgeted, we're defining that as items that were not addressed by the budget prior to March 27th. So any action that we've taken after March 27th is still eligible under this funding. And I really say that because I think one of the recommendations that staff will have is that we seek reimbursement for the $1 million business stabilization grants. We did perform that amendment, I believe, on April 9th, so it definitely qualifies for that. We could also consider the Economic Development and Social Services funding that I just presented a few slides ago. But I think this maybe warrants a council discussion, maybe at your next meeting or maybe the meeting after that, in terms of how you really want to approach this funding. There is some thought that it makes some sense to reserve some of this funding for some of those unknown issues that may occur. I know there's some regional discussions about assisting businesses, so that may be an option as well. So really, I put this as a placeholder for you, the council, to consider here in the future. There's nothing in this budget amendment directly addressing this, but certainly something the council should consider. There's time for the council to deliberate on how to approach this. The CARES Act itself at the federal level, the eligibility for costs is all calendar year 2020, but with the state's different fiscal year, I think the actual due date is going to be the end of September. But again, that's off into the future, and you certainly have time to have some thoughtful discussion on how to address this. And then I did want to point out that I've already begun the 2021 budget development process. We normally begin in May. This is definitely going to be a different type of budget, and I think it's going to be potentially a difficult one in terms of the development as we move forward. But I did want you to know that I have started that, and we'll start having those discussions soon. So of course, the recommendation is you do adopt ordinance that will amend the 2020 budget, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Can you take us back to or close that screen down? Great. Can I get a motion, please?
I would move to adopt ordinance 1567, amending the 2020 budget.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded, and now we're on to discussion. Deputy Mayor?
So I actually have two, but I'll ask my first question and then you eventually come back to me. The one about cutting 200,000 to the LED program, when it actually saves us money, seems kind of
I think you're reading that wrong. We saved $200,000 from that program.
Oh, is that correct? That's what I wasn't sure. I kept reading it. I went back to it, kept reading it. Okay, excellent. Yes, okay. That makes so much more sense than cutting that and then not saving any money. Okay, so somebody else can.
Councilmember Steven?
I would just say, tough financial times is nothing new to this council. Yourself, Deputy Mayor Pratt, and Lenny have a couple years more experience than me in these situations and making tough, financial, sound, good decisions on behalf of the citizens. So we've been here before. We'll get through it. And that's just a comment is all I wanted to make. I mean, we remember the overlay program not being able to fund that, and so.
Thank you. Councilmember Kunkel, can you please unmute yourself then?
Yes. I just want to give a special thank you to Troy Wu for all your hard work and effort. I know this was not an easy process, and between you and the staff making all these efforts to find ways to cut back, I just appreciate that. And I know that we're going to be going through some tough times, but I'm glad that you're at the helm, Mr. Wu, and you are handling this very proficiently. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate the support. It's definitely a team effort.
Councilmember Greenstein.
Just one question for you, Troy. How comfortable are you with using 1 month of the 2-month reserve? That's the only part that worries me. Obviously, that's what it's there for, so I think it's appropriate. But how much does that concern you, being that there's a lot of guesswork right now? I mean, this could actually be worse than we think it is, and do we have other sources if that's the case, if we use that money now?
That's a great question. It is exactly what it's for. I mean, to help us through cash flow issues and the emergencies like this. You do have healthy reserves elsewhere that you can repurpose back into this. We've had the foresight as an organization and you as a council in terms of being conservative with reserves and identifying those for specific purposes. So you can repurpose those other reserves. It is going to lead to potentially hard decisions by the council, but we do have ways of replenishing that reserve. Another concern is by, in a sense, deferring $3.6 million in cuts, we're kicking the problem down the road, and that's maybe more of a concern. But I think it's the prudent thing for the council to do. It is. We don't know how bad it is, and we don't know how quickly things may recover. We don't know the full impacts of the federal aid. At this point, we really know much less than we should, and I think it's prudent to gather more information and make informed decisions at that time. But you do have other options in terms of reserves and replenishing that.
So just a quick follow-up to that. Will it affect when we do our state audit every year? Isn't there, I think 2 months is what we're supposed to have in reserve for that reason, right? Will this affect that audit? Would that cause us to have a finding in that audit?
No, that's a good question. Actually, Scott and I just had a discussion about that in terms of, are we violating policy? And the policy isn't specific enough to talk about how long we have to replenish that. But in past lives, I worked for a city that didn't have any reserve beyond that minimum operating reserve. And in an event like this, you go below that and you have to come up with just a plan to replenish that. And I think it's the same answer, whether we have other reserves to replenish that or not. You have to expect it's going to take an organization some time to replenish that. So I'm not overly concerned about the violation of the policy potentially. I think that reasonableness will rule and that we have to have time to replenish that in future years or other sources.
Thank you very much.
Anything else, Deputy Mayor?
So I'm following up with the LTAC information, and it looked like it gets pretty darn low. And maybe Council Member Miller can partly answer this. What happens if we don't get back where we can replenish some of that early enough? Does that make sense? I mean, it said it was, if you're taking away from that amount, are we still able to put more money back into that as a jurisdiction, or other cities do that so they don't go under?
Maybe I'll take
No, Councilmember, you're putting him on the spot since he's only had one meeting. So here's the deal. No, so that's money that comes in from lodging dollars, right? And so we collect that money and we get to redistribute it on a reimbursable basis. And so since that money's not coming in, we're not able to reimburse LTAC events. And so in the future, say for next year, the amount of we're going to be able to distribute is going to be a lot lower than historic levels because the lodging's way down. And so all this does is put pressure on our ability to fund LTAC events, like all the great events we have in the city of Lacey, the barbecue fest, the senior games, list goes on. They won't be able to apply for as much money as they have in the past.
So that was my kind of follow-up question, is that next year our events that we assume will be able to get going again may be compromised. Is that the assumption? Yeah, okay.
Without doubt. Yeah, without doubt. It's going to take a while to build those dollars up again, those LTAC dollars up again. Does anyone else have a question? Well, in my first blushing on this, first of all, that's good work, Troy. And I can also see why we have such healthy reserves at the end of the year after your fancy budgeting. So, but I like your conservative approach, and I'm glad we're in this ability to be able to, make some of these decisions right now without really hurting the organization. And so it's nice to be in this situation. I'm sure it's a lot nicer being the finance director of Lacey and having more options than some of the other jurisdictions I'm talking to are in panic mode right now because they don't have the reserves that we do. And my heart goes out to them because that's a tough situation where you're immediately having to lay off your employees, which provide the services to the public. So luckily we're not there yet. I think it's gonna we have some difficult decisions we're gonna have to make in this upcoming budget, and we're just gonna have to play this a little bit by ear. And like the city manager said last year, luckily we're in an area that can rebound sooner than other areas, given that Joint Base Lewis McChord's right here, the state's right here. We have some of our that our health profession is going to be obviously strong, hopefully. So hopefully they'll be able to keep our economy going a little bit. And it's also the other side of not having those real big sales tax collectors like an auto mall or a Westfield mall or something like that, where when your budget is completely based around a couple major items and the economy drops, there goes your budget for everything. So I guess it's the pros and cons. So given that, Councilmember Stedman?
Thanks, Mayor. I just wanted to make a comment that it's not the city that's in this alone. We brought up these festivals and the nonprofits that run most of them. They're not immune to this either. And that's why it's important that when they do have successful events, especially several years in a row, that they hold and manage their, finances and keep a proper amount of reserves for these tough times and not be solely dependent on, city and citizens for fundraising. So,
yeah, that's been an ongoing conversation in the LTAC world for a long time. That's for sure. So given that, it's been moved and seconded to adopt this ordinance 1567, adopting the 2020 budget. All in favor of that motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you, Troy.
Thank you.
Just real quick under Mayor's report, since our next discussion is the Community Development Block Grant discussion. As a part of the CARES Act, we were able to see that $1.5 million that Troy was talking about, and luckily we were able to receive that. Not all cities received direct allocations. All that money went to the states, and it was up to the states to decide how they're going to distribute it to to the cities, if they're going to distribute to the cities at all. Luckily, we have, through the Association of Washington Cities and a lot of hard work, there was a good discussion that happened with Commerce, and we were able to figure this out per capita. And so we are getting some direct allocation money that, for that. Another part of the CARES Act is some additional community development block grant money going to the counties. And this has been an ongoing discussion that we've had with our regional partners, the other jurisdictions in Thurston County, on how we're going to allocate those funds. And I was on a conference call yesterday with the county and the other cities, and we've been talking all along how we want to take a regional approach to these funds. And maybe through a lot of different discussions, we decided to look at, well, let's look at the food insecurity first, and maybe we're going to help those organizations. But a part of those discussions, we also found out that this region most likely will get additional community development block grant funding in the near future. We don't know how much or when it's going to happen, but that, according to our federal lobbyists and those who are close to this program, it does sound like there's other funding that's going to come, that between the community development, the other CARES Act funding, there are some other decisions that we're going to be able to make in the future to help those who are in need in our community. And so just going into this next discussion, I know we've had some conversations about how should we do something different with this money, but it really sounds to me like we will have additional funding to help with COVID-19 and the effects on our economy. And this community development block grant funding that we're talking about, right, we're going to discuss next, is, I think, safe to say we can treat it like our normal every 3-year allocation. And so I just sort of want to say that up front as part of my mayor's report. Deputy Mayor?
Well, I wanted to follow up on that. United Way got CARES money, and then some of that for the emergency food and shelter program through FEMA, they got a second, quite a lot of money for their round 37. And so you're right, this is basically just our normal CDBG funding rather than trying to cover everything for everybody.
Councilmember Greenstein?
Yeah, I have a question really for you, Mayor. The meeting you attended yesterday with the county, are they in agreement at this point with that money being shared then? The money that came to them as part of our,
Yes.
CDBG funding?
So yeah, that was been an ongoing conversation, and at one point it felt like the county was going to try to make a decision on their own around that money, and it sort of ruffled the hair of several jurisdictions, including us, saying, hey, we need to be part of this conversation. Since then, and even yesterday with Commissioner Hutchison running that meeting, they've agreed that no, this needs to be a regional conversation. And actually, if you look at the language of the community development block grant, this funding, it says right in the language that you need to coordinate with the jurisdictions. And so I think it's been made pretty clear that's what's going to happen. And I think at this point, we're all on the same page with that. And
thank you for taking the leadership on that and making sure we were heard, because I was concerned early on that was not the direction they were thinking, and clearly the way they got the allocation was because of our urban community. So thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. No problem. No problem. So having that, I'm going to turn it over to the city manager for this discussion on our proposed project proposals.
And I'm going to hand that over to Steve Kirkman.
Leadership right there. Maybe.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So John, I'm not seeing my video. Am I good to go there?
I don't see.
I guess
oh,
if
there
I
you go.
hit start video, that would work better. Okay, sorry about that. Still getting the hang of these Zoom things. So thank you very much. I'm going to just share my screen briefly to bring up the project list that we had at our hearing on the 23rd. And just to remind council, and just for folks at home that may not have all the notes in front of them, we received 7 projects totaling and I'm not seeing my screen share there. So just give me a moment to.
1.235.
Yeah,
Will?
1.235, and for some reason.
There you go.
Okay, now apparently that is gonna work, maybe. There we go, sorry about that. Okay, so 1.236 rounded up, which is about $172,000 above the available funding level, which is approximately $1.063 million. So that's actually really a good thing. Normally, I think 3 years ago, we had over $1 million or near $1 million in the spread. So that's a good thing. We, as I mentioned to council last week, we kept our public comment period open through the 27th at 12 noon. And I just want to inform council that we received no public written comment on the projects or the process. Thurston County has requested that this body try to have their funding decisions to them by the 22nd of this month, so they can adequately meet HUD's timing requirements. As you know, they have to do several things at the county level and then forward those to HUD, and HUD has to do several things at the federal level, and all that's supposed to be sort of wrapped up in July. So there is a pretty tight timeline there. I just want to circle back on the COVID briefly and inform council that in 2017, we awarded approximately $70,000 to Community Youth Services to do some rehab on a duplex they have over off of Ruddle Road. It's transitional housing. And for various reasons, that rehab project was not going the way CYS wanted it to go. So they've approached us and meeting us in the county and asked if they can reallocate that $70,000 towards COVID response activities. Specifically, what they would like to do is gear up their shelter that they run to be 24/7 and to take into account social distancing. So it can be actually used as a COVID emergency shelter for their population. The county and my office have tentatively said, and in consultation with the city manager, have said, yeah, we're in favor of that. We're assuming council will be, but we will obviously want to give you the opportunity tonight to comment on that. And as we had last week, we have county staff available in the wings, and John can plug them into tonight's interactive meeting so they can answer questions if we have additional questions beyond the scope of our expertise here in the city. And I think that's basically everything I want to talk about. So I think I will start. The city manager has volunteered to drive an interactive spreadsheet here in a couple.
Yeah. Can you give us the 2 scenarios that we've been talking about?
So we can kind of run through funding scenarios and see what the effect will be on the bottom line. And we can just kind of, and I'm still seeing that it's sharing. So hold on a sec here.
So Steve, do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
You have it.
Okay.
So as you know, we're about 171,000 short. And so here's a couple of different options, just sort of back of the napkin. You want to talk about them, Scott?
Yeah, so everyone should see this. So you should see my cursor. Here are the 7 applicants that we received for the CDBG funding. In bold are the requests that each applicant asked for into this program. And again, this is just for discussion purposes. One way to think about this, what if everyone took an equal cut to make up the $172,000 difference? That would essentially be a 14% reduction to each request made by the 7 applicants. Another way to look at this, again, just to have discussion amongst the policymakers, is a 14% cut is pretty detrimental to a smaller request, say like Grub with 15,000. So an alternative would be to focus on those that had an ask of $200,000 and above and have them absorb the $172,000 difference. So in that case, that would include the Veterans Hub, Homes First, and Food Bank. If they absorbed the $172,000, that would be a 16% reduction from their original ask. So for instance, the Veterans Hub asked for $500,000, they would be just under $422,000. And again, we have another option there. If council wanted to explore other alternatives, we can also do that.
So yeah, this is, I think here are, 2 very reasonable options. And I would be fine with either way. I do kind of agree with our city manager here that when Grub's asking for a 14% reduction for them is a way bigger hit, since it's such a smaller number proportionally than if it's some of the larger. So I'm tending to lean towards option 2 a little more, but I am open up for council discussion. Can you does everyone understand the 2 options? Option 1 is everyone takes a 14% cut. Option 2 is just the top 3 over 200,000. They would end up, instead of taking a 14%, they take a 16% cut, and then you would leave whole the Boys and Girls Club, the Child Care Action Council, and have that for humanity. Can you unshare that screen, Scott, so I can see everyone? Councilmember Greenstein.
Yeah, I'm leaning toward option 2, but I have a slight variation that I had kind of worked up the numbers on that I kind of like, I think, just a little bit better. It's not much of a variation, but what that would be is, rather than doing it by, so again, it only affects the 3 largest ones. The 4 smaller ones stay whole. The 3 larger ones, though, instead of doing it by percentage, doing it by a flat amount. So if you do the math about the shortage, it comes out to $57,117 off of each of the 3. So the Veterans Hub winds up with $442,883. Homes First gets $192,883, and the Food Bank gets $292,883. So it's not a huge difference. Gives a little bit more to the Veterans Hub than it does in this particular model, but it's each of them taking an equal share, 57,000 off the 3 big ones, all 4 of the small ones being whole.
Deputy Mayor, can you please unmute yourself? Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah,
there you go.
sorry. I sort of did similar, Councilmember Greenstein, but I ended up like the Boys and Girls Club. I just rounded it out to 45,000, and then I left the Child Care Center and Grub whole, and I just took a shade off of each one. Like the city of the Veterans Hub, I went to 450,000. The South Sound Habitat for Humanity, I did 50,000, and then Homes First, I went down to 200,000, and the Food Bank to 320. So just shaving a little from the larger ones, but leaving the smaller ones whole. But the Boys and Girls Club, I actually just rounded to a flat number to 45,000.
Does anyone else have Councilmember Stedman?
Thank you, Mayor. The food bank holds our name, and we've made a commitment to it. I think it should be off limits here. I mean, that's coming from somebody that, loves the Lacey Veterans Service Hub too, and all the good work that Homes First does with, the low inventory and high cost housing. I think, we could take a little bit maybe off the Boys and Girls Club because they're such good capital campaign fundraising team there. But, even there, I mean, there's no easy decision. There's no easy button. But I think the food bank should be off limits. You can see the use that's coming in a pandemic crisis situation.
So I normally would totally agree with you, Councilmember Stedman. And that's one of the reasons why I talked about in the last, right before this, is that I think the food bank is about ready to receive quite a bit of CDBG dollars coming their way. I mean, we all sort of, the region said, let's start with them first and make sure we can feed people. So in this circumstance, it feels quite bad.
This was more of my prepared statement that I came in to go with, and that was prior to what you contributed to the discussion.
Sure. Councilmember Cox?
Having just been through a lot of this negotiating with the Health and Human Services Council over grants, it's really easy to get bogged down into shave a little here, shave a little there, and debate all that. And I think in the end, what the option 2 that the city manager is proposing is fair. It's, it's across the board. It saves the little guys, gives them their cut, and then it's an even hit across the board for the larger applicants. And I think that's just a logical way to move forward on this. And I really don't think, I mean, I know it's, yeah, this group might be getting this grant and all that, but I don't think we can go there. I think we ought to just consider this on the merits and move forward with the fairest possible decision.
Are you there too, Councilmember Kunkel? Okay, I sort of am too. I mean, we've been discussing this with the city manager, and it's so all these are great, right? I would go with whatever anyone agreed with, but just going over it and over and over it, it just seems to make the most sense that option number 2 in my mind. But
Mr. Mayor, I would make a motion that we accept option number 2 for the distribution of the CDBG funds.
I second.
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 it's been moving second. Is there any other discussion? Councilmember Stedman.
If by some miracle we fall into a bunch of money by end of the calendar year or into the fiscal year, we could always, give more money later, I'm assuming, or
like I said, it'll be interesting to see how these other rounds of CDBG money comes in and what we can do. So I think there will be some opportunity there. And I usually wouldn't say that, but in this circumstance, I think, we're in extreme circumstance. So it's been moved in second to accept the option number 2 distribution. All in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Is there any opposed? The motion carries. And next up, we need to discuss the $71,000 reallocation. I am okay with this reallocation. Right, COVID. I don't think there's much to discuss.
Do you need a motion on this?
Do you need a formal motion, Steve?
It'd be good to do, yeah.
I would move that we allow the reallocation of the fund, the $71,000 in funds.
I second that.
For the record, it's like 69,850 or something, so just shy of 70.
Just for
So
the record,
I'll amend my motion to that number.
Me too.
It's been moved in second to allow this reallocation. Councilmember Cox?
I just for record keeping purposes, could we make the motion a little bit more specific about who we're allowing to reallocate this?
Yeah, can you go over that real quick, Steve?
Certainly. So it's Community Youth Services, and they were in the 2017 funding cycle. So exactly 3 years ago, you awarded them the $69,000, $70,000 for duplex rehab. So it would be granting Community Youth Services the permission or authority or whatever the flexibility to reallocate their the prior funding for duplex rehab or housing rehab, can't even talk, for housing rehabilitation to COVID-related shelter activities.
So moved.
Yeah, moved and seconded. that brings up a good question. Is there not a use or lose it time frame for these funds?
So,
I'm
sir-
surprised it's been 3 years. I'm surprised they haven't had to use those funds.
Yes and no. It's actually a collective use it or lose it, not an individual use it or lose it. And so Tom and his great staff have a real tight buffer they can work within, and they can't go beyond that for projects that are outside of their original timeline scope. And they're masters at keeping enough folks on track that this project is not currently causing issues with their grant management cycle and the folks back at HUD. So they're in good shape. And this actually, by making this contract adjustment, will help them keep it in within the established buffers. Yep.
Thank you. It's been moved and second to reallocate this money to community use services. All in favor of the motion, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion carries.
Thank you.
And thank you. We do have one item under other business. Our city attorney needs to give us a quick update about some LID foreclosures.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon, council. So I'd like to foreshadow real briefly an agenda item that we will be bringing forward to you next council meeting. So during this pandemic, council's taken several steps to alleviate some of the negative economic effects that COVID-19 has had on Lacey citizens. I'm thinking in terms of deferring the B&O taxes and suspending enforcement action for delinquent utility accounts, relaxing sign regulations, et cetera. Additionally, the governor's taken action to place a moratorium on residential and some commercial evictions. So in that line of thinking, I'd like to direct council's attention to the delinquent LID assessment. So these are local improvement districts that have previously been created. There's 3 active ones, LID 21, 23, and 24. Each of them, the property owners within those districts they are assessed annually as a fixed amount. Now, LMC, Lacey Municipal Code, mandates that any property owner who is delinquent by 2 assessments, that the city initiate foreclosure proceedings against that property by June 1st of the year in which the delinquencies occur. So we're coming up on that pretty quickly. Additionally, there's an ordinance on the books that mandates penalties be imposed for assessments that are delinquent. And there's one of the LIDs, I'm not sure which one, but one of them is due as early as this month, and then another one is due in July, and then the final one is due in November. So our recommendation is that I have a resolution prepared that I'm going to have on the agenda next council meeting. And that recommendation is going to be for council to suspend sections of the LMC that would require enforcement action or that would impose penalties on delinquencies for those assessments. What this action would have the effect of would be tolling foreclosure proceedings for this calendar year. And it would be in line with other council actions taken previously that I spoke of earlier. I guess finally, I just indicate that it wouldn't put the city in any compromised position. The city would still be able to collect the full amount. So with that, we're not asking for action today. I just wanted to give council a heads up, an opportunity for any questions if you have any. This will be, unless you tell me not to, I intend to bring this before you on the 28th.
Councilmember Greenstein.
I did have one question. So you said the current municipal code, we have to do it by June. So and obviously that's coming up pretty quick. This will preserve all of our rights though, right? So we don't lose that because we're gonna go past June. We don't lose the ability to come back to that money.
Yeah, no, that's correct. Hopefully, the ideal would be that property owners would bring themselves out of foreclosure status. But when the calendar 21 turns over, anybody that's then delinquent 2 assessments, we would then initiate those proceedings by June of 2021. So if they brought themselves out of foreclosure status but no, we wouldn't be waiving. If they didn't do anything at that point, we would be, they would be delinquent maybe perhaps by 3 installments. And we'd be able to recover them.
Councilmember Conklin?
Is there a risk for these individuals facing foreclosure? Is there a risk that their property could be foreclosed upon before we can take action? And how would that affect the city of Lacey?
Well, our liens are subordinate to property taxes, but typically they're going to be superior to pretty much anything else. So if another, there's been instances in the past where we had yet to initiate action, but the county did for property tax purposes, and then we were compensated through that foreclosure action for our outstanding balances. So no, there's no risk there.
Yeah. So this doesn't prevent the county from foreclosing. It's just preventing us. Or that's what we're saying. We're not going to.
There is a limit to your authority. That's right.
Yes.
This is just for the local improvement district assessments.
Yes, got it. Deputy Mayor.
I just want to follow through. So if this is deferred and they come out of what is it, bankruptcy, you said? Would they be required to pay the whole lump sum that they owe all at once, or is it, how does that work?
Well, if we were in council chambers, I'd look to Mr. Wu to really quickly answer that question. But no, they wouldn't be required to pay the lump sum. Once an account is delinquent, the whole amount is then due and payable, but that doesn't mean that the city is going to go after the entire amount. It just means that if the foreclosure went through, the city would be reimbursed for the entire amount. A property owner has the ability to get themselves out of foreclosure status by paying a much smaller amount than is actually would be foreclosed upon. I think several of the properties and there's 4 total that we're talking about. So there's 4 property owners that this would have an impact on. 3 of them could bring themselves out of foreclosure with a payment of $769. So that's another element here, is that this is, I don't want to say draconian, but it's a pretty strong move to initiate a foreclosure proceeding when the amount is that small. So that's what we're talking about. But it is a mandate in the LMC, and it does need to be addressed. There is one property, and it's affiliated with Local Improvement District number 23. To refresh council's memory, this is the sewer project that took place on Martin Way and College Street, maybe 6-7 years ago. Mm-hmm. The hotel, so its amount is much larger than that, I think, but it's still under $20,000 for them to come out of the foreclosure amount.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. Councilmember Stedman.
Thank you, Mayor. So, David, what I'm hearing you say is we can't be more than second or third in line in the lien list if it ever came down to actually foreclosing and all, going through the whole proceedings. We'd be lien list number 2 behind the county. There's not much room for anyone else to leapfrog us.
Fairly confident in that. That's right.
Okay. Councilmember Cox.
Just for sake of discussion, is there any wiggle room in this at all, Dave? We've been talking about the impacts on people of COVID and all that, and I don't want the city to be shorted. But is there a way to cut people any slack at all on this, or extend the timeline?
That's what we're doing. That's what we're going to bring before you.
Councilmember Cox, the proposed action would suspend enforcement action.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I'll have, again, I don't have material. I just wanted to foreshadow the issue for you tonight. You'll have a resolution to review and a staff report to review prior to your next council meeting, so that you'll be more well versed on the issue before you have to make a decision on it, obviously.
Thank you for that. I just kind of didn't quite pick up on that.
Councilmember Stedman.
Is payment deferments a possible something that we could consider? You guys heard me say it before in recent meetings since COVID started, that lien holders or lenders, banking institutions, in a lot of cases they'll give you a 3-month deferment, and those payments are just added to the end of the life of the loan kind of deal. I don't know if that's an option for us, but if it is, or something along those lines, could relieve, give some relief to the debt holder.
So I think you're going to say this, right? That's exactly what we're going to do is we're going to suspend the penalties, but we're going to keep the interest, but just the interest will go on the end.
The interest is being accrued. Again, I'd love to have Mr. Wu kind of outline this perfectly for me. But again, these are improvements that the city paid for, and these property owners were assessed. That assessment was by ordinance, so that is a fixed amount. The interest was assessed on the whole, and they pay that annually. So as far as it's not a payment for services. The effect of the action that's proposed would give them more time to pay it. So you can look at that as a deferment, but the amount is still owed. And I don't believe there's a way in which we can change that.
No, but we aren't going to assess the penalties, though. We're not going to be assessing the penalties.
Correct.
For this. And so that's what
interest is accruing whether they're delinquent or not.
Yes. Everyone get it? Great. Well, we've reached our agenda. Thanks for that. I appreciate that. And we'll obviously discuss a little bit more about that next meeting. We've reached the end of our agenda. Everyone out there, stay healthy. As always, you keep it classy, Lacey, and I'll call this meeting adjourned.
Take care, everybody.